Good evening again. This is Ana Ruiz, General Manager. This evening, we are bringing forth the findings of the Science Advisory Panel in response to questions posed by the Midpen Board of Directors on the topic of grazing based on a literature review of peer-reviewed scientific journals and research papers. This marks a major milestone in working with an outside independent panel of scientific experts and PhD researchers affiliated with the San Francisco Estuary Institute and Point Blue Conservation Science, both of whom are well regarded and respected across the Bay Area for their science-based analysis of natural resource and land stewardship topics. In an effort to further inform Midpen's own land management decisions with the best available science, the board directed the formation of the Science Advisory Panel in 2019 and selected 3 topics for study with specific questions for each topic. And today we return with the Science Advisory Panel's findings for the first topic on grazing. Midpen is one of a few agencies in the Bay Area that is bringing in expert scientists and researchers to present the latest science-based information on land management topics to inform our understanding of best practices, new approaches, cause and effects, and alternative approaches based on sound, reliable, peer-reviewed scientific literature, recognizing that there is a lot of mixed information available in the mainstream across numerous communication platforms with questionable reliability, objectivity, and thoroughness. I want to take a moment to highlight that the Science Advisory Panel's findings are based on peer-reviewed journals and research papers, which are written by experts that are reviewed by several other experts in the field before the work is published in order to ensure quality and scientific validity. I state this since there are many articles written and published that are not peer-reviewed, but yet considered by some as having equal weight and merit without recognizing that there is truly a difference. As I mentioned, the topic we will cover tonight is on grazing, a topic that I know has generated mixed opinions from specific individuals as Midpen has evaluated various aspects of the conservation grazing program, which is in part why the board selected this topic for the scientific literature review. In particular, we will be covering the latest findings on the effects of grazing as a tool to manage grasslands and protect biodiversity, to manage fuel loads and reduce wildland fire risk, on the associated greenhouse gas emissions and opportunities to help offset these emissions, and on viable alternatives to achieve the same land management goals on a large landscape scale, recognizing that Midpen has successfully preserved over 64,000 acres of open space lands with more than 10,000 acres of grassland habitat across 26 preserves. After reviewing the presentation tonight from Midpen staff and from members of the Science Advisory Panel, the board will have an opportunity to ask questions on the state of the science, the scientific review process, and the conclusions. As this information is still relatively hot off the press, so to speak, we are still evaluating how to best incorporate the findings into our day-to-day work. For one thing, the scientific review has uncovered some interesting ideas on how we can further expand carbon sequestration potential within our grazing landscapes while still preserving a mosaic of important grassland patches for biodiversity. This is one area, for example, that certainly merits further attention. At the end of the presentation, Midpen staff will briefly discuss some of these next steps, which we will begin to program into our upcoming fiscal year action plan. Finally, I want to end my opening remarks with a look at the broader context of grazing as it applies to Midpen's work, our coastside mission, and the commitments made by Midpen to the public on the long-term management of open rangelands. These rangelands are part of the portfolio of open space lands that Midpen has acquired to preserve in perpetuity as assemblages of critical wildlife habitat, important wildlife corridors, and to preserve the scenic, rural, and natural resource values within our region for current and for future generations. A mission we take to heart, realizing the incredible population growth anticipated in San Mateo and Santa Clara counties, which so far is expected to grow by nearly 200,000 housing units, close to 500,000 people, within the next 10 years, according to the latest regional housing needs allocations that are being developed by the Association of Bay Area Governments and Metropolitan Transportation Commission. Midpen's mission on the coast side acknowledges the agricultural character and long-standing working land heritage of the San Mateo County coast, and the fact that an active agricultural community continues to be very much present and part of the fabric of this rural community. More specifically, our coastline mission, along with open space preservation, natural resource protection, and public access, includes the preservation of agricultural lands, the preservation of rural character, and encouragement of viable agricultural uses of land resources. As an open space district who is always working on furthering biodiversity goals and landscape level habitat sustainability, we know that we cannot be fully successful in protecting our region's unique natural resources, known as one of the 36 global biodiversity hotspots, without integrating agricultural landscapes into our protected lands. Otherwise, we can end up over time with fragmented habitats across the Santa Cruz Mountains that lack an essential system of protected wildlife corridors for the ongoing health and survivability of our local plants and wildlife. Since incorporating the San Mateo County coast as part of our jurisdiction in 2004, we have preserved over 11,500 acres of coastside lands with large swaths of coastal grasslands and extensive miles of riparian corridors, including some of the more intact and undisturbed watersheds still remaining on the San Francisco Peninsula. And many of these lands have a long history as actively grazed rangelands. As we have integrated agricultural lands into our preserves and expanded our land holdings, we have looked at grazing as not only a use that aligns with Midpen's coastside mission, but also as a land management tool that can be applied to the landscape level to help us preserve our grasslands and keep brush encroachment at bay. Moreover, given our changing climate and longer, drier, fire seasons that have led to one of the most destructive fire years in California history, that now includes the August CZU fire in San Mateo County, grazing is also a useful tool in managing fuel loads to reduce wildfire risk in wildland areas. As Midpen continues to manage more than 10,000 acres of grasslands at this massive scale, rangeland grazing continues to be an effective, cost-effective, and efficient land management tool to manage grassland habitats. With all this said, Midpen realizes that there is always more we can learn and adjustments we can incorporate into our land management work as future research is conducted and as new findings are published. Grazing is one of the many areas where the science is still expanding, and today we have additional valid science-based information from the Science Advisory Panel that is shaping our thinking around grazing and offering new ideas of how we can adjust our land management strategies to continue deriving the benefits while further offsetting negative effects associated with methane emissions. And with that, I'd like to hand this over now to Sophie Crystal, our Science Advisory Panel Project Manager and Natural Resources Management Analyst, to begin the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna, for that intro. And Lydia, if you want to advance to the next slide. As Anna said, my name is Sophie Crystal. I'm the management analyst for Midpen's Natural Resources Department, and I've been the project manager for the Science Advisory Panel. And Lydia, sorry, next slide again. Tonight, our Science Advisory Panel consultants from the San Francisco Estuary Institute, or SFEI, will be presenting the findings from their research on the board's selected grazing topics. We know this has been a subject of a lot of interest from both the board and the public, so we're excited to share the outcomes of the panel's scientific literature review and hopefully answer some questions tonight. We've structured the presentation to allow for a question and answer conversation at the end, so if you could please hold your questions to that point, that would be appreciated. Thank you for that. And Lydia, next slide. This is just an overview of our agenda. I will begin by introducing the purpose and process of the Science Advisory Panel's work and give a little context regarding Midpen's conservation grazing program. Then I'll hand over the podium to our Science Advisory Panel representatives, our consultants Lydia Vaughn and Erica Spotswood from SFEI. They'll present their results and conclusions regarding the grazing topics, and that will be followed by a brief presentation from Midpen's Natural Resources Manager, Kirk Lennington, on how we plan to use this new valuable information going forward. Finally, we'll close with a Q&A from the board to address any questions regarding the panel's conclusion. Our Science Advisory Panel speakers, as well as the Technical Advisory Committee on this topic and Midpen staff subject matter experts, will all be available to answer questions during that time. Next slide. So the purpose of the Science Advisory Panel, as Anna sort of went over, is to enhance the scientific validity of ecosystem management decisions and serve as an important resource to inform regional management topics. As land and resource managers, we at Midpen want our decisions to be based on science and data whenever possible. However, we're not an academic institution and we don't have the staff time necessarily to devote to researching everything that we and our board would love to understand in depth. Therefore, in December 2018, it was proposed that we convene a panel of independent experts that could help us fill that gap. The SAP is meant to provide an objective review and interpretation of the best available science, report their findings to staff and to the board, and ultimately provide a scientific basis and data-driven lens through which Midpen staff can make open space management decisions. Next slide. The process with the SAP kicked off in December 2018 when the idea was first proposed to the board. Throughout 2019, the board and committees refined the SAP's purpose and function, and we awarded the contract to the San Francisco Estuary Institute, or SFEI, and their sub-consultant, Point Blue Conservation Science, two highly esteemed local science institutes that focus on ecology, conservation, and earth sciences. Topics for the first round of research were vetted by the PNR committee in November 2019, and 3 topics were ultimately selected by the full board in January 2020. Tonight's grazing topic is 1, and research on the other 2, which cover topics about recreation trade-offs and benefits and monitoring biodiversity at the landscape scale. Those 2 topics will continue through this coming June, along with a possible 4th topic that the board would select in early 2021. Next slide. That brings me to tonight's focus, which is grazing. So these are the questions about grazing that the board approved in January. First off, what is the net climate impact of cattle grazing? What are the district's options, such as grazing regimes or dietary additives to reduce emissions from cattle grazing? 2, what are the current scientific results on the effectiveness of managing grasslands and reducing fire risk with cattle grazing? And finally, how does cattle grazing as a land management strategy compare to alternatives in achieving district goals, including climate protection, and what are the trade-offs? Our SAP has done a deep and broad review of the existing peer-reviewed science to answer these questions as best they can based on the research that is available. I want to preface their findings by mentioning that for the questions for managing for fire and grassland biodiversity, the scientific The scientific findings apply fairly broadly to the types of ecosystems in our rangelands, and therefore what's true in another California coastal grassland is most likely true in ours. But specifically for carbon sequestration, a lot depends on site-specific factors. So it's not possible to provide precise numbers without studies actually done on our lands. Therefore, their conclusions address this question a bit more generally with regard to the climate impact of grazing and the types of land management that can help offset that impact. These are still important conclusions for us to guide our management decisions, although there may be a need for more targeted research on our preserves. Next slide. And now I'd like to provide some additional context about Midpen's conservation grazing program. And next slide again. Our conservation grazing program began in 2007, and currently we lease approximately 9,000 acres to 7 conservation grazing tenants. These leases encompass 11 properties on 5 preserves, and they range in size from about 280 acres to over 2,700 acres. I should note that the lease size is generally much larger than the actual area that's grazed because it includes areas like steep, brushy slopes, or sensitive riparian areas where cattle are either not able to or not permitted to access. On each lease, the conservation grazing tenants manage anywhere from 20 to around 200 cattle. And this depends on acreage, but also how much water and forage is available and on the condition of the land and our management goals for that location. In total, there are around 550 to 600 cattle on Midpen lands, although the number varies both seasonally and year to year. Next slide. This is a map showing the grazing lease areas. For our members of the board and anyone else who's following along with the packet, this is the same map as attachment 2 to the board report on this item. Again, I want to reiterate that cattle are not allowed to roam anywhere in these lease boundaries. The actual grazed area is smaller, but it is difficult to map, so at the moment we don't have a GIS layer for that, although it is something we would like to produce in the future. Next slide. So how did we get here? It started in the 1990s when the San Mateo coast was facing a lot of development pressure and many local residents were eager to see open spaces protected. So Midpen began a long public process to evaluate annexing part of San Mateo County into our district. During those discussions, it became clear that along with the land, the protection of the region's agricultural heritage and economy was of utmost importance to coastsiders. Together, we produced a coastal mission statement for Midpen, which expands on our general mission statement to include the preservation of rural character and encouraging viable agricultural use of land resources. We completed the annexation process in 2004, and since then, Midpen has been able to protect over 11,000 acres on the coast side, including the majority of our grazed properties. Next slide. Management of the lands in our conservation grazing program is guided by our resource management policies, like all our land management decisions. These policies are high-level, board-approved policies and practices that set a framework for resource management, provide a decision-making tool to staff and the board, and inform the public of Midpen's intentions in open space management. All of these policies can be found on our website. The resource management policies have their own mission statement. The district will protect and restore the diversity and integrity of its resources and ecological processes for their value to the environment and to people, and will provide for the use of the preserves consistent with resource protection. Examples of our resource management policies include policies for wildlife, vegetation, water, and of course, grazing management, along with others. Next slide. The grazing management policy's goals are as follows: to manage the district land utilizing livestock grazing that is protective of natural resources and compatible with public access, to maintain and enhance the diversity of native plant and animal communities, to manage vegetation fuel for fire protection, to help sustain the local agricultural economy, and to preserve and foster appreciation for the region's rural agricultural heritage. The grazing management policy works together with our other resource management policies to inform our land management decisions. Next slide. And that concludes the background and context portion of our presentations tonight. And it brings me to the next segment, which is the Science Advisory Panel's report. Tonight, we have with us two members of the Science Advisory Panel, Lydia Vaughn and Erica Spotswood. Lydia Vaughn is an environmental scientist in the Resilient Landscapes program at SFEI, where she works on projects related to terrestrial ecology, ecosystem carbon storage, and greenhouse gas dynamics, with a focus on California ecosystems. She received her MS and PhD from the Energy and Resources Group at UC Berkeley, and her research there spanned thawing permafrost, wetland methane emissions, and ecological considerations for land-based carbon sequestration strategies. Erica Spotswood is a senior scientist in the Resilient Landscapes program at SFEI and lead scientist of the Urban Nature Lab, which explores building ecological resilience through urban greening in cities. Her areas of expertise include urban ecology and community ecology. Erica received her PhD from the Range Ecology Lab at UC Berkeley in the Department of Environmental Science, Policy, and Management. After graduating, she completed postdoctoral research with restoration and climate change ecologist Catherine Suding. Lydia, Erica, it's your turn. Take it away.
Thank you so much, Sophie and General Manager Ruiz, for that comprehensive introduction. This is Lydia Smith Vaughn, and I will be delivering the slides for this presentation, though Erica and the other advisors on the project are here as well to answer questions following the presentation. So, as has been introduced, this particular topic for the Science Advisory Panel was around issues related to the effects of cattle grazing on Midpen's management goals. Now, we've gotten a very nice background so far in this conversation on some of the issues around conservation grazing and how that's used currently on Midpen lands. But I think it's also important to offer a little bit of background on disturbance within grassland ecosystems of the California Central Coast. So the grassland ecosystems within this region have a long history of natural and human disturbance. Prior to European settlement, the region was grazed by native ungulates such as tule elk, and this region is thought to have been managed with fire by Native American communities. Roughly 200 years ago, these disturbance regimes changed dramatically when European settlers came to the region. So at this time, livestock largely replaced the native grazers, and fire suppression also changed the frequency with which this landscape burned. Since then, grazing by livestock has been a dominant land use in the region. So the illustration shown here depicts a dairy in San Mateo County. This is from 1878. And if you look in the background, you can see cattle grazing far into the hills. Now, with the introduction of cattle and other livestock, an important effect of this change in disturbance regime included the introduction of non-native grasses by European settlers, and those outcompeted much of the native vegetation and now dominate the region's grassland vegetation. While livestock grazing has been a dominant use for the past 200 years, it's actually now in decline across this region. And there has been a notable loss of rangelands to development and to cultivated agriculture. In spite of the vegetation changes and habitat loss due to anthropogenic habitat loss and introduced species, California grasslands still remain hotspots for biodiversity. This region is home to a very diverse community of native plants and vertebrate species, many of which are endemic. Importantly, it's also worth noting that the native grasslands of California can be considered an endangered ecosystem. And this is due to losses of much of the historical grassland area since European settlement. Now, along with this habitat loss and along with the shifts in the vegetation community, many of the native species are now threatened or endangered. So among these are, for example, the burrowing owl, the threatened California red-legged frog, the endangered Santa Cruz tar plant, and the endangered San Francisco garter snake, all depicted here. Now, as sort of a very general approach to preserving this remaining native vegetation and wildlife, protecting open grasslands and managing them for biodiversity are sort of the broad scale ways in which land managers approach this. So as Sophie offered a nice introduction on, among Midpen's land management strategies, their lands include about 9,000 acres that are managed through conservation grazing leases with ranchers. Now, conservation grazing, or the use of cattle grazing for biodiversity conservation, is underlain by two fundamental concepts. The first of those is that grazing maintains open grassland. Now, in the case of Midpen, land conservation in this instant isn't directly necessarily dependent on having cattle on the landscape. Midpen, for example, is not their conservation of land is not dependent on their grazing program. However, another way that this has been viewed within the literature is that access to public rangeland through grazing leases can actually be a critical tool for ranchers to maintain and sustain their operations. And in this case, grazing on public lands, such as grazing that's practiced by Midpen, can actually be an important force in protecting private ranches from development. So that's one concept underlying conservation grazing for biodiversity. And then a second sort of fundamental concept or premise is the idea that cattle on the landscape can be managed in such a way that they enhance native biodiversity through maintaining conditions that favor native species over introduced or invasive species, and through creating suitable habitat for native wildlife. This project and this science topic interrogates the second concept, or asks the question of how the literature supports whether or not grazing can be a tool to manage healthy ecosystems. Now, using a review of the scientific literature, we evaluated how Midpen's grazing program supports or detracts from their land management goals. And the particular management goals that we investigated in this literature review were biodiversity support, climate protection, and wildfire risk management. So in this presentation, I'll discuss our findings on how cattle grazing relates to these goals given the available science on the subject. And I'll also discuss alternatives to cattle grazing to meet these goals. Many of these alternatives are already in use by Midpen as part of their management portfolio. So to answer the question of how cattle grazing affects Midpen's management goals of conserving biodiversity, protecting the climate, and managing wildfire risk, we conducted a review of the scientific literature. Now, this is an issue that's already been raised this evening, but we also want to note that we do recognize that in some instances, special interest groups can be vocal or even misleading on this subject, particularly within the non-journal, non-peer-reviewed literature. So for that reason, we restricted our search to peer-reviewed articles only. And this was in order to ensure the scientific integrity of our findings. This search ultimately included over 125 scientific articles spanning the management topics. And these articles included both primary research papers as well as review and synthesis articles. Now, given the ecological heterogeneity that characterizes California's ecosystems, we prioritized research from the San Mateo coast and more broadly the Central Coast, but we also included studies from other grasslands in California. And then in addition, for context, we also looked at US-wide or global literature when appropriate. Following this literature review, the overall project included a synthesis workshop with Midpen staff to discuss some of our findings, and also a written report summarizing the findings. To conduct this work, the scientific team was chosen to span a range of disciplines that are central to this project. So these disciplines include grassland and rangeland ecology, carbon cycling and climate change, and wildfire risk management in California, as well as a deep knowledge of grazing management for conservation purposes. As I've mentioned, while I am currently presenting these findings, the whole team you see here is in attendance to this meeting and will be available to answer questions after the presentation. So before getting into some of the details of our findings, I just want to offer a high-level overview of the primary conclusions. Broadly speaking, the scientific literature supports the finding that grazing is beneficial for some, but not all of Midpen's management goals. Conservation grazing can be a beneficial management tool for biodiversity support. It can be used to protect open grassland, to increase the diversity and cover of native grassland plants, to control invasive species, and to provide habitat for native wildlife, including, for example, sensitive species like California red-legged frog. In contrast with these benefits, cattle grazing does entail a cost to the climate for methane and other greenhouse gas emissions. These emissions are relatively small compared with other greenhouse gas sources. However, they do present a trade-off between climate impacts and other of Midpen's land stewardship goals. To minimize this trade-off, conservation grazing may be coupled with other strategies to offset a portion of these carbon emissions. And then third, cattle grazing is generally understood to mitigate wildfire risk, though the literature on this topic is actually quite limited for this region of California, and controlled studies in particular are highly limited. To manage fire risk and protect native grassland biodiversity, several alternatives to cattle grazing exist, and these include mechanical approaches, herbicide applications, prescribed fire, and grazing or browsing by species other than cattle. These alternatives vary in their suitability across the diverse terrain and the diverse management needs of Midpen lands. And overall, our literature review supports the finding that these approaches may be most effective when used as complements rather than alternatives to Midpen's conservation grazing. Cattle grazing in California is often framed by the literature through the context of a reintroduced disturbance, a disturbance that affects vegetation composition, vegetation function, and vegetation structure. As I mentioned, this area has a long history of disturbance, and that history goes back far before European settlement of the region. The landscape is generally understood to have been burned periodically by Native Americans, and additionally, native ungulates grazed the landscape prior to introduced livestock. So without going into the nitty-gritty of ecological theory, what I'll say is that it's generally understood by ecological theory that intermediate or moderate levels of disturbance are broadly thought to maximize biodiversity opportunities. And this is by maintaining a variable range of conditions that allow different species to persist and exploit those resources. In the San Mateo coast, the landscape has been changed in a number of ways. And one of those ways is the removal of historical disturbance regimes. As I mentioned, there's quite a bit of research around livestock grazing that's framed through the lens of an introduced disturbance. And this essentially investigates whether by returning a moderate level of disturbance to the landscape, livestock grazing effectively achieves biodiversity benefits. And here, conservation grazing in the region can directly influence grassland biodiversity through its effects on the composition of vegetation and diversity of vegetation, the physiology of this vegetation, or in other words, the way that it grows, on the vegetation's physical structure. For instance, heterogeneity in plant heights or variations in vegetated and bare patches across the landscape. And then stemming from these effects, the overall sort of broad effects on biodiversity fall into three main buckets. So the first is these direct effects on native and non-native grassland vegetation. Second is effects on woody vegetation. And then third is effects on native wildlife habitat. So here I'll talk about each one of these sort of broad buckets. In California grasslands, perennial bunch grasses such as purple needlegrass and California oatgrass, shown here, are thought to have been historically important in locations near the coast. These grass species have largely been replaced by introduced European annual grasses. And accordingly, a management priority in coastal grasslands is commonly to manage in such a way to sustain or increase the cover of these native grasses. Now, studies that have evaluated the effects of livestock grazing on these native perennial grasses have reported a really wide range of findings. And ultimately, the findings appear to depend on the individual species in question, to depend on site characteristics, and also to depend on specifics around how the experiment itself was conducted. Sort of synthesizing across this broad body of literature, a review of grazing and biodiversity in California's Mediterranean type grasslands has concluded that livestock grazing ultimately appears to have little effect on native perennial grass diversity. And so fundamentally, while these findings vary from site to site or among landscape positions, the literature generally supports the finding that grazing is considered to be compatible with the persistence of these grasses, with, again, some variability among individual sites and individual studies. For native forbs, on the other hand, forbs being herbaceous species that aren't grasses or sedges, studies have reported some clear benefits of grazing. Cattle preferentially consume introduced grasses and also maintain low levels of dead plant material on the ground surface. And both of these effects can favor the success of native annual forbs over introduced grass species. So in general, grazing has been found to benefit native forbs more so than native grasses. That said, findings have been mixed across specific studies, across specific sites, and also across specific plant guilds, such as perennial forbs versus versus annual forbs. An example of this is a study that is sort of one of the more applicable studies to this topic in this region. And that was a study done by Hayes and Hall in 2003, in which the authors paired grazed and ungrazed sites in a transect along coastal California. And the authors of this study found that grazing increased the cover of native annual forbs and also increased the number of species, but also decreased the cover of native perennial forbs. Accordingly, with this finding echoed by a number of other studies, a common recommendation of many studies in the literature is to maintain a mosaic across the landscape of grazed sites, ungrazed sites, and different grazing regimes in order to support the breadth of vegetation diversity. While grazing has been shown to benefit native forbs, it's also been shown to affect non-native forbs. Grazing as well can benefit non-native forbs. For instance, a synthesis of 15 studies from California found that while livestock grazing increased the cover of native forbs, the cover of non-native forbs had an even greater positive response to grazing. Now, an important note to make is that a challenge with the literature on this topic is that the majority of studies evaluating grazing treat grazing as a binary variable, essentially looking at sites that are grazed and looking at sites that are ungrazed. In truth, in order to actually sort of glean the most informative information regarding grazing and grassland biodiversity, it's actually important to consider specific management approaches, though the literature on this is considerably more slim. And one instance of this, or one example of this, is that grazing that is targeted toward invasive species management may be more effective than just sort of broad scale grazing. So grazing timed to reduce the seed production of invasive species may be more effective at reducing exotic plant cover and at increasing native plant cover than just simple year-round grazing. And this image here shows on the left an ungrazed paddock, and on the right an area that was grazed during the wet season explicitly to control yellow star thistle. And you can see a picture of yellow star thistle here. And really what you see here on the left is this abundant thatch of yellow star thistle plant skeletons in the ungrazed area. In addition to its effects on herbaceous vegetation, cattle grazing also has a role affecting patterns of woody vegetation and open grassland across the landscape. Over the past 100 years, extensive shrub encroachment into coastal grasslands in California, this has been attributed largely to the exclusion of livestock grazing and fire suppression. So here in the top left, you can see aerial imagery from the East Bay that shows between the mid 20th century and the late 20th century, an increase in the area of shrubs within the photographs. And then similarly on the bottom left, these are images from the early 1900s and the early 2000s from near the Crystal Springs Reservoir that very clearly show this woody encroachment or increase in woody vegetation in this region of California. Now, shrub encroachment, and specifically also particularly coyote brush encroachment in coastal California grasslands can have the effect of increasing fire hazard and also leading to a loss of plant diversity. Studies from Jasper Ridge and from Point Reyes, for example, have observed a decline in the abundance and the diversity of herbaceous species in areas that have been heavily invaded by coyote brush. And in addition to these proximate effects of grazing on shrub encroachment, this also links to longer-term successional effects. Shrub expansion in central coastal California can facilitate broader changes in the region's vegetation communities. So successional patterns in this region indicate transitions from grassland to shrubland, and then from shrubland to woodland. And also in addition, more targeted studies have observed the effect of shrubs facilitating the establishment of hardwood or conifer species, or essentially facilitating the successional transition from grassland to woody vegetation. So following up those effects on herbaceous and woody vegetation, an important component of biodiversity and livestock grazing is the role of livestock grazing as it maintains habitat for sensitive wildlife species. A study, an 8-year-long study in the Diablo Range, found that livestock grazing had led to either neutral or positive responses from grassland birds. And here you can see the western meadowlark and the grasshopper sparrow on the left. And the positive responses in particular were due in part to the benefits of grazing for native plants, and also the effects of grazing on creating structural heterogeneity within the vegetation that provides important habitat for these songbirds. Similarly, burrowing owls require the short vegetation and the matrix of open sites maintained by grazing livestock. And also grazing is understood to have various benefits for California red-legged frog. Ground squirrel burrows in grazed lands offer frogs refuge from predation. And in addition, stock ponds are used by California red-legged frog for breeding or foraging. I should also note that stock ponds also provide foraging habitat for the endangered San Francisco garter snake. So that was a lot of information on a diverse array of different biodiversity categories. But to sum up, livestock preferentially consume introduced grasses. Livestock reduce vegetation height and cover and limit dead plant material. And these effects often benefit native forbs, native songbirds, and other wildlife species. So here, native grasses and native forbs are sometimes benefited by grazing, sometimes not. But in general, looking across a range of different biodiversity effects, we find that livestock grazing, particularly when it is conducted in order to maintain a mosaic across the landscape of grazed sites, of ungrazed sites, and of different grazing regimes, can benefit the various plant and wildlife species present on Midpen lands. Now, moving on from the topic of biodiversity to the topic of climate protection. Put very simply, cattle grazing is a source of methane to the atmosphere. This figure is from a publication that came out this year that shows one of the most up-to-date methane budgets of methane emissions to the atmosphere. And as you can see, the second arrow from the left is the agriculture and waste sector, which is a really important source on a global scale of methane emissions. And within this sector, livestock is only a portion of that, but it is the dominant portion of this sector. And this is fundamentally driven in large part by the fact that livestock, particularly cattle, ruminants emit methane that's produced by microbes in their gut, microbes that aid in their digestion. And methane, of course, is a highly potent greenhouse gas, and that's particularly true over short timescales. So over a 20-year time frame, methane, when approximated into common units with CO2, is roughly 85 times as powerful over a 20-year time frame, or over 100 years, roughly 30 times as powerful as a greenhouse gas as CO2. Ultimately, simply put, greenhouse gas emissions associated with livestock present a trade-off with biodiversity benefits. All that said, it is also important to consider the magnitude of greenhouse gas emissions associated with midpen grazing in context. So the map shown here shows on a global scale the per square kilometer greenhouse gas emissions from livestock. And I should note that what you see here includes a wide range of livestock related emission sources. So not only methane produced by ruminants like cattle, but also greenhouse gases emitted from feed production and manure, and importantly, greenhouse gas emissions from land use change, which is particularly important in certain regions of the globe, like the Amazon. Now, put in this global perspective, Midpen's grazing-related greenhouse gas emissions are relatively low on a per acre basis. They're in the low to moderate range of this scale. Now, fundamentally, from the perspective of Midpen, this is a really good thing. While the cattle that are grazed on Midpen lands do emit methane, this effect, or this greenhouse gas source, is really dwarfed by other greenhouse gas sources. And that's the case both in the context of livestock from other livestock systems, and also particularly within the state of California from fossil fuel emissions. So on a global scale, given that there is a large carbon footprint associated with livestock grazing, numerous studies have evaluated opportunities to reduce or offset these livestock-related greenhouse gas emissions. So first here, I'm going to offer some background on how this is thought about in a global context, or in other words, how emissions may be managed to offset, or offset across a variety of systems and land use types where livestock are managed. And then I am going to bring it to the Midpen scale by discussing the category of these approaches that's really most applicable to the conservation grazing practiced on Midpen lands, and that's managing livestock to sequester soil carbon. And then finally, I'm also going to talk about a couple other livestock adjacent ways that carbon may be managed in rangeland systems in order to offset livestock-based emissions. And those are ways that have the potential to be relevant, in particular on Midpen lands. So taking a global view, there are a number of strategies to reduce or offset livestock greenhouse gas emissions. And these include improving livestock feed, intensifying agriculture, largely to avoid land use change. They include manure management and also enhanced soil carbon sequestration. Now, these different strategies focus on either reducing enteric fermentation or the production of methane by ruminants, focus on reducing emissions from waste, reducing the rate of land conversion, or offsetting emissions by sequestering carbon in soils. So the figure you see here shows the mitigation potential, the greenhouse gas mitigation potential of different approaches when they are scaled up across the globe, across the full extent of viable rangeland, viable grazed land, or livestock land, excuse me. And what I really want to point out here is that the red color depicts the range of estimated mitigation potentials. And particularly in the context of carbon sequestration due to improved grazing management, you can see here just how highly uncertain some of these strategies are and how highly variable they are. In general, these approaches, not specific to Midpen, but broadly speaking, have the potential to offset some, but not all, of greenhouse gas emissions associated with livestock grazing. An important point to make is that these strategies offer the greatest promise and greatest potential in degraded lands, overgrazed lands, and in sites with less developed economies. In contrast, Midpen lands, which may have lower potential for many of these strategies, or for which many of these strategies are not applicable, these lands and the livestock managed on Midpen lands are already well managed. So that just sets the stage or creates a scenario in which the history of land stewardship on Midpen lands does have an influence on the range of possibilities for restoration of that land and for carbon management within that land. So among those strategies, the strategy most relevant to conservation grazing practiced on Midpen lands is managing rangelands to sequester soil carbon. And this falls within the bucket of management strategies that's commonly referred to as carbon farming. Essentially, soil carbon sequestration is achieved through some combination of increasing carbon inputs into soils and decreasing carbon outputs. So that can be achieved through increasing vegetation production, increasing the way that vegetation or the portion of the carbon vegetation takes in that goes directly below ground. It can also be achieved through decreasing decomposition of that carbon. Improved grazing practices that are potentially tailored toward increasing soil carbon sequestration include, broadly speaking, livestock removal, changing stocking rates of livestock on the landscape, or implementing specific grazing practices, such as a category of practices referred to as high intensity rotational grazing. And in this, paddocks are rotated between periods where they are intensely grazed and periods of rest. And as I mentioned previously, there are other grassland management practices that can be used to sequester carbon. And these include compost applications and also include silvopasture, or in California, this really refers to increasing the presence of oaks within rangelands, and also riparian regeneration. Fundamentally, the literature broadly finds that, not specific to California, but in California and beyond, soil carbon sequestration explicitly through improved grazing practices is thought to be quite limited and also quite site specific. Now, specifically in coastal California, predicting the effects of grazing on soil carbon is really quite difficult. Here, there is very little primary research that's been done on this topic. Most studies from California are from other regions of the state, and again, really compare only the presence or absence of grazing rather than comparing specific grazing management systems. Existing studies from California, while not explicitly from the San Mateo coast or even coastal California, generally suggest that grazing management is not a promising strategy to increase soil carbon storage. So here, this figure comes from a study that was conducted in the Sierra foothills. And here the areas that were grazed are in green, and the areas that are not grazed are in blue. And on the y-axis, you see soil organic carbon. So how much carbon is stored in the soil per unit area. And then the left side of the figure shows soils under an oak canopy, and the right side of the figure shows open grassland. And really, this main finding has been supported by other studies in California, which show that the presence of oaks within rangeland does have a meaningful effect of increasing soil carbon. But when comparing grazed sites and ungrazed sites, significant effects really have not been seen in the amount of soil carbon that's stored there. So given sort of the potential, either lack of information or lack of potential to manage carbon through grazing management, to offset livestock-related carbon emissions, other strategies do exist to manage carbon in California rangelands. Compost applications or compost amendments have the potential to sequester soil carbon while also increasing forage productivity and drought resilience of vegetation. So evidence from 2 California rangeland sites suggest that compost applications may sequester roughly 160 kilograms of carbon per acre per year. Important to note following this finding is that this finding is really based on a very limited number of sites and limited number of studies. And these few published studies really offer only very preliminary and limited evidence of carbon benefits. So there really is a need for an increased amount of research in this area before real conclusions are drawn about the potential for compost applications to benefit carbon sequestration. Additionally, also very importantly, the effects of compost applications on grassland biodiversity are not well understood. And there is reason to hypothesize that compost amendments could have the potential to shift competitive balance of the vegetation in these grasslands in a way that may not favor native vegetation. So that again is an area that really has not been sufficiently explored to date. An alternative approach, sort of what I consider a livestock adjacent approach, is riparian restoration or silvopasture, alternatively, which, as I mentioned, is sort of planting or facilitating the recruitment of oaks within rangelands. And either of these strategies have the potential to sequester carbon in soils and also in above ground vegetation. So riparian forest regeneration has been seen across several studies conducted both in California rangelands and also in abandoned croplands. It's been seen to have the potential to sequester 1,600 kilograms of carbon per acre per year over the first several decades. And that's again in both vegetation and soils. So to tie together our findings around greenhouse gases and climate protection, we find that cattle grazing is a source of greenhouse gases to the atmosphere. And unless these greenhouse gas emissions are offset through carbon sequestration or other emissions reductions, this presents a trade-off with Midpen's other land stewardship goals. To offset livestock-related carbon emissions, we find that improved grazing management likely has low potential. We find that compost applications are another potential approach, but this really presents both uncertain benefits and also uncertain biodiversity trade-offs. And we find that the practice of silvopasture and riparian regeneration does have broadly high potential for carbon sequestration, but possibly more limited potential or unknown potential on Midpen lands. And this is an area where, again, carbon sequestration in Midpen lands is just challenged by the fact that these lands are already quite well managed and many of the riparian areas are fenced. So that reduces the potential area on the landscape that this practice can be put into place. But our understanding is that it's not, there are some areas that potentially could be additionally fenced. This is a subject for the staff to pursue further. And also with regard to increasing the number of oaks on the landscape, I think it's sort of a common idea that California landscapes, if it weren't for European settlers, would be a sort of thick woodland of oaks, but this isn't necessarily the case across many California landscapes. So before really considering the potential for carbon sequestration through oak regeneration, an important first step would be a careful historical ecology study of sort of the capacity of this particular landscape to support oaks and whether that's an appropriate action to take. Now, across California, livestock grazing is also widely used to limit the risk of wildfire. And as I think we're all too keenly aware right now, this is a management need of increasing importance in the area. Here, again, these are images that show shrub expansion in the East Bay Hills between the mid to late 20th century. And transitions from grassland to coyote brush dominated shrublands have been seen to increase the risk of high intensity fire. By reducing herbaceous biomass and by limiting certain woody fuels, cattle grazing can reduce wildfire intensity and can decrease flame height. And these two factors are really important for the success and the safety of firefighting efforts. And then one additional finding in the literature that's sort of broadly across the state of California is that since the mid 20th century, an increase in wildfire that has been documented across federally managed rangelands has been attributed to a decline in livestock grazing. So as I said at the beginning of this presentation, there really is a limit to the amount of primary research controlled studies looking at the effect of livestock on fuel structure and on wildfire behavior within this region. But broadly speaking, the literature does support the use of livestock grazing to limit wildfire risk. To manage fire risk or to manage for native grassland biodiversity, alternatives exist to cattle grazing. And these include mechanical approaches, herbicide applications, prescribed fire, or grazing or browsing by other species than cattle. So here, over the last few slides of this presentation, I'm going to touch on some of the uses of these different approaches, their best applications, and also some challenges associated with these that may be considered when choosing a management practice to either replace or complement cattle grazing. And fundamentally, the conclusion that sort of runs as a current through all of these different approaches is that each of these may best be seen as a complement rather than an alternative to conservation livestock grazing for the large-scale land management that Midpen practices. Mechanical approaches to vegetation management include mowing, hand pulling, and other mechanized treatment. These approaches are used by Midpen, and they're broadly and commonly used by other land managers as well to maintain open grassland and to target invasive species. These methods can be tailored either to large-scale vegetation management when the terrain allows it, or targeted toward control, in more focused ways, control of invasive species. As I mentioned, these are broadly used. However, mechanical approaches do have a number of downsides. For one thing, they're only feasible on gentle terrain. For another thing, they carry a large carbon footprint. So as a replacement to cattle grazing, they don't offer a good alternative to address the climate trade-off with Midpen's grazing program. And additionally, these mechanical treatments are expensive. And this high cost is particularly the case on Midpen lands where mechanized treatment is done in ecologically minded ways that add to the expense of treatment, for example, using biological monitors to avoid direct wildlife mortality. And then finally, the effects of mechanical approaches are fundamentally not equivalent to the effects of cattle grazing. They're really not likely to lead to the type of structural heterogeneity that's created by livestock grazing. Herbicide is one of the most effective and one of the most commonly used management strategies for controlling invasive species in rangelands. As with mechanical approaches, this is one of the strategies Midpen employs in their integrated pest management plan. Not to go into detail about their plan, what I will say is that the herbicides used on Midpen lands are screened for toxicity to humans and other organisms, for persistence and mobility in the environment, and for their efficacy against target invasive species. So this can really be a powerful tool in land management and invasive species control. That said, herbicide applications are more expensive than grazing. And additionally, many of the herbicides that are used are toxic to all plants. And this makes them appropriate for spot applications rather than broadcast treatments to replace the large scale effects that grazing has as a management tool. Prescribed fire is another management tool that is a widely supported component of open space management. Midpen policy includes the use of prescribed fire, or in other words, includes reintroducing fire to the landscape in order to manage fuel loads and in order to control invasive species. Specifically, studies have found that prescribed fire is compatible with certain ecological communities. It's compatible with San Francisco garter snake and chaparral bird conservation. But again, as with the other management approaches, each of these approaches presents some challenges. Prescribed fire is expensive, it requires permitting, and I think most importantly, the effects of prescribed fire may depend on site characteristics, on the frequency of burning, and also the timing of burning. And in several studies, it's been shown that 2 or more consecutive annual burns may be needed in order to control invasive vegetation. So for large-scale land management, it presents a challenge to conduct burns with the frequency needed to effectively manage vegetation. And the last alternative approach I'll present is using herbivore species other than cattle to manage vegetation. And here, targeted grazing by sheep and goats can be used to combat shrub encroachment and to manage fire risk as well as invasive species. And this really can be particularly useful on steep terrain. A challenge associated particularly with these smaller livestock is that smaller animals may increase the risks of livestock predator conflict. And it may be important to include a non-lethal deterrent to help manage this conflict. Additionally, Thule elk can limit shrub encroachment and other invasive species, and also have been found to increase native plant richness. Thule elk have been reintroduced in other areas within the region, but this presents challenges as well. Elk are difficult to manage. They require more robust fencing than cattle, and they also have been found to require population control to manage their populations. And then lastly, all of these animals mentioned are ruminants, and like cattle, they release methane. Not to the same degree as cattle, but it can't be seen as a replacement that eliminates the methane cost of cattle grazing. So to manage fire risk or native grassland biodiversity, each of these options we find may best be seen as a complement rather than an alternative to the conservation livestock grazing practiced on Midpen lands. That covered a broad range of material. And I really just want to sum it up with a few final points before we move on. I think next is the question and answer period. So first of all, I just want to note that there are many ways to graze. Livestock grazing, when seen on a global basis, really has been massively destructive to natural ecosystems and the climate. However, Midpen's conservation grazing program is fundamentally very different from much of the livestock grazing that's practiced in other areas. This program entails low stocking rates, residual dry matter targets. It entails biodiversity monitoring to support data-driven management decisions, and also fencing of riparian areas. So with this context, we find that the literature supports the use of conservation grazing as a beneficial management tool to protect open grassland, to increase the diversity and cover of native grassland plants, to control invasive species, and to provide habitat for native wildlife, including sensitive species like California red-legged frog. We also find that methane emissions do entail a trade-off between climate protection and other land stewardship goals, and that land-based carbon management has the potential to offset some of these methane emissions. Now, while the existing literature generally supports Midpen's use of livestock grazing to achieve its management goals, we also want to note that only a subset of studies have been conducted on the San Mateo coast or other coastal California grasslands. So given the limits to the scientific literature in this region, an adaptive and science-based management approach is recommended as more research becomes available. And in particular, I think even above and beyond incorporating research in future management, opportunities to actually practice adaptive management and enact research on Midpen lands would be greatly beneficial to better understanding these relationships. So with that, I am happy to turn things over to Kirk. And I would be happy to help Kirk with the rest of the panel field any questions from the board and from the public.
Wonderful. Thank you, Lydia. That was a fantastic presentation. Thank you very much for doing that for us. If you could advance to the next slide. I had planned on making a few comments before turning the evening back over to the board for questions and comments, and then public comment as well. Here I present again the questions that were referred to our science panel by the board. I think that we can agree that we've heard a very robust presentation of sound science. And the purpose of tonight's presentation was to make sure that the results of this work was clearly communicated and presented to the board. We're just now starting to work on where we go from here and what does this information mean for our management of our rangeland properties. If you could advance to the next slide for me, Lydia, please. This was my somewhat clunky attempt to try to reform this very complicated issue of our conservation grazing program back from its component pieces that we broke it into to be able to look at the different elements and have the science panel give us the information that's available. And so here you can see the main themes that we discussed this evening. And then also on the right of the slide, you'll also see that I've included our coastal mission that Sophie discussed at the beginning of the presentation. And all of these come into play when we look at our use of cattle to manage the landscape. And all of these, although it was simpler to present them in isolation, actually when we're looking at the management of the land, they all come together as a package. And it's not possible to look at one particular issue without looking at all the other issues. So I generalize here biodiversity. The results largely point to conservation grazing being a benefit for the management and retention of biodiversity on the landscape. And significantly, the science panel found that the highest biodiversity can be achieved with this mosaic of grassland ecosystem types and management actions. And so that's that mix of grazed and ungrazed properties within which our preserves fit. We do not graze all of our grassland habitats. We do not graze all of our preserves. Likewise, looking more broadly across the San Mateo coast, not all of the landscape that could be grazed is grazed. And so there is a natural retention of that mosaic of different grassland types that I think is working well to maintain biodiversity. However, the acreage of grassland that is grazed is decreasing over time. And in particular, that is a threat to the preservation of the coastal terrace prairie habitat types. We also touched on wildland fuels management, and I think that the results of the research do support that cattle are an effective tool for managing grassland habitats for the fuels. And regarding climate change, clearly methane emissions and the climate effects of cattle grazing are concerning. And this is an area that we're going to continue to pursue for the available research that we can contribute to and actions that we can take to reduce and offset these emissions. In particular, we are starting a carbon farming plan, conservation carbon farming plan, in partnership with the San Mateo Resource Conservation District to further explore ways that we can increase the sequestration of carbon on our rangeland and grazed properties. And particularly the expansion of woody vegetation within some of our ranch properties appears that it's going to be a very viable means for us to increase carbon sequestration. There's absolutely room for us to expand riparian habitats, as well as identifying those areas on ranches that are already being taken over by brush and do not have a lot of underlying native grassland species that are being pushed out by that brush encroachment. And there might be some of those areas that we just want to retain that brush woody overgrowth because it provides a good mechanism to sequester carbon. And then finally, the alternative methods to cattle grazing. Lydia did a very nice job summarizing what those are. And they all have their benefits and their constraints for our use of them to replace cattle grazing. Mechanical, using tractors to mow the vegetation seems to be one of the mechanisms or treatment types that could cover the most acreage, but we are talking about a very large acreage on a very diverse landscape with a lot of terrain. There's a lot of areas that mechanical equipment cannot get to, and we would not be able to have any kind of treatment on that vegetation using or relying on mechanical means. Herbicides is not feasible across large areas, nor is it desirable. We have goals to reduce to the maximum extent our use of herbicides, and so we use them as spot treatments for highly invasive species only. Prescribed fire is another area that we hope to expand our use of. But again, this is not feasible on all areas or necessarily at a large scale. Additionally, it comes with secondary impacts for smoke, risk of escape for some of the fire. There is also a high cost associated with that. And then finally, alternative species to try to replace cattle grazing with, that would be sheep and goats, tule elk. There are limited opportunities for us to partner with the private sector to implement these alternative species across a large acreage like we currently employ cattle. In San Mateo County, there is not much of a market for these other species. There are goat herds that do a good job in brush management, and this is a tool that we use ourselves. But to manage grassland habitats, we would need sheep primarily, probably, or tule elk. And tule elk would be a complicated reintroduction process that would take some time for us to work through with Department of Fish and Wildlife. In addition, as Lydia pointed out, there would be costly infrastructure upgrades that would be necessary for that. And of course, with all these, there is a cost of staff time, just the dollars cost that we would incur, as well as some of these other limitations. And not to overlook the fact that we have a coastal mission statement and a service plan and policies that obligate us to preserve the rural character and encourage viable agriculture on the coast. And that is certainly a factor as we look at our use of cattle to achieve our conservation management objectives and our service plan objectives on the coast. And with that, I think we're ready for questions. And so I have one additional slide, Lydia, and I'll turn it back over to President Holman.